What made statues come alive? Well, there were three things that made statues come alive, so to speak. The statue's base, its context, and its coloring. Let's go through these one by one. First, the statue base. Bases serve the purpose of supporting the statue, of lifting it above the level of the viewer and making it more visually prominent, and of providing information about the statue in the form of an inscribed text. Most statues that you see in museums today do not stand on their original bases. The Riace bronzes A and B are two very good examples. The Riace bronzes are two of the most well-preserved and famous original Greek bronze sculptures that have survived from classical antiquity. And yet, their bases don't survive, or if they do survive, we don't know where they are. In the museum today, both of these sculptures appear to be standing on a gravel surface, as if they are standing on the ground. This is somewhat misleading because originally these two statues certainly stood on big bronze bases, and they would not have looked like this. The Boxer is another example. The base doesn't survive. What you see today in the museum is a modern base meant to represent a stone outcropping of some kind. Now, the Boxer might have been supported by a similar looking base, but we just don't know. So this is the museum's best guess. But one of the most important things that's missing from the Boxer's display in the museum is any kind of indication of a base with an inscription. Certainly it would have had a base with an inscription on the front. The Venus de Milo is another good example. It does have a plinth. The plinth is that thin marble slab underneath of the feet, but that is not the base. The entire sculpture would have been inserted into the top of a bronze base or a marble base, and the plinth would have been clamped to the top of the base to hold the statue securely onto the base. Here's an excellent example of a sculpture that survives with its base intact. The famous statue of a woman named Phrysichleia, dating to the middle of the 6th century BC, or the period that we call the Archaic period. The base has an inscription on the front. It's not in great shape, but enough of it survives that we can read what it says. And it states, "Tomb of Phrysichleia. I shall be called Kore forever. Allotted this name from the gods in place of marriage. Aristeion of Paros created me." So, the inscription on the base tells the story of her life up to the point of her untimely death when she was fairly young. Her name was Phrysichleia. She was a young woman, maybe even a teenager. We don't exactly know how old she was when she died, but the inscription states that this person died before marriage. The name Kore was an honorific term, meaning in general a youthful woman. But in this case, the name stands in for the name that she would have had if she had gotten married. The sculptor by the name of Aristeion made the statue. Phresyclea must have come from a wealthy family, because this would have been a very expensive kind of grave marker to have made for your daughter. In another example from the Hellenistic period, this is a statue of the goddess Themis. The inscription on the front of the base tells us that this is Themis. It also says that a man by the name of Megacles paid for this sculpture. And it also gives us the name of the sculptor as well. So this is an image of a goddess, Themis. It was a dedication in a temple sanctuary. It's a very large votive gift or votive offering. And it was paid for by a well-known man in the community. So in this case, the inscription is telling us something about not only who is being depicted, but it's communicating information about the wealth of the family who paid for it. So this kind of inscription is really important to communicate to passersby, to visitors who saw the statue, not only what the statue was, but who paid for it. And it communicated that this family was wealthy enough to be able to afford such a lavish gift to the goddess. So in this case, the statue base is performing a political function. This is a statue and a base from Aphrodisias. It's later in date. It dates to around the end of the 2nd century AD. And the statue depicts a man by the name of Antonius Claudius Domitianus Diogenes. He came from a wealthy family at Aphrodisias. The base is quite different than the bases that we've seen in the last two slides. This base is very tall. It's basically as tall as the statue itself. So one of the main purposes of this base was to lift the statue high above its surroundings, high above people passing by. Then on the front of the base is a rather lengthy inscription telling us who this man was, telling us who his father was, and telling us why the statue was placed of him at this location. This statue was placed in front of the town's council house, the Bouleuterion. And this man, Domitianus Diogenes, was a wealthy local town councilor of the city. He had accomplished quite a lot in his life, and this statue honored him while he was still alive for his accomplishments and achievements for the city. In the case of a statue like this, sometimes they were paid for by private individuals, but often, as in the case of this statue, they could be paid for by the city itself as a way of honoring the achievements of its most important citizens. Okay, the second aspect of a statue that makes it come alive is the display context. And we've just talked a little bit about display context for the statue of Domitianus Diogenes. His statue stood in front of the Bouleuterion, which was a very, very visually conspicuous location for a statue. Often, we just don't understand the original display contexts for statues that we see in museums today. Going back to the Riace bronzes, those two statues were found by swimmers in shallow water off the coast of southern Italy in the early 1970s. They sank in a ship during the Roman period. We have no idea what their original display context was. Most likely, they stood in a public space in a big Greek city somewhere, or possibly they stood in a temple sanctuary, but we just don't know. In the case of the Venus de Milo, we have a general idea about its display context, but we can't be absolutely sure. It was found in the ruins of a Greek gymnasium. So most likely it stood in a niche of a wall in that gymnasium, or possibly it stood on a statue base along the portico of that gymnasium. But we can't be absolutely sure where it stood. This is a sculpture that I was lucky to find in 2005 at Aphrodisias. I excavated this sculpture while I was excavating a large room in a big Roman basilica. The head of the sculpture is the main part of it that survives. There you see the head in that photograph on the left, still in situ in the earth before we lifted it out of the ground. And then on the right, you see the cover of the book on which the sculpture was published in 2008. This slide gives you a general idea of the display context for this statue. Remember, all we have is the head and the find spot to go on, but we can be fairly sure that the statue stood in a big niche of this building that's drawn for you. This was a very grand interior space, and the statue was one of several other statues that were displayed in statue niches along the wall of this grand interior space. We can't be absolutely sure about how the statue was displayed, but we have a pretty good idea about it. So in this case, this incredibly grand interior architecture gave the sculpture quite a lot of additional meaning, and it enhanced any qualities that the sculpture itself might have had. The last feature that brought statues alive, so to speak, is color. Most statues were brightly painted. This is in fact the lost dimension of ancient sculpture in stone because it is rarely preserved. We will be waiting until later in the semester to learn more about the subject of the lost painted coloring of sculptures. Stay tuned.